The engine died. His Messerschmitt lost all power. The aircraft drifted silently through frozen air. Hans faced three terrible options. He could crash into German soil, hope to survive the impact, crawl from twisted metal and flames, or he could bail out over friendly territory, face a military tribunal for losing precious equipment, answer for destroying a fighter Germany could not replace. But on that bitter morning in December 1944, Hans made an impossible choice. He guided his powerless fighter beyond German lines. He landed among American forces. He surrendered himself to the enemy. Why would a Luftwaffe test pilot make such a decision? This man had helped create the Me-262. He possessed secrets that could shift the balance of air warfare. What drove him to hand everything over to America? That single moment would reshape the future of flight forever. December 1944 brought winter's grip to Europe. The continent lay trapped beneath ice and death. Every German breath formed clouds in the bitter cold. Those clouds rose into skies that had turned hostile. The Luftwaffe was dying. What had once been a thundering force of conquest now wheezed like a broken machine. Bombers had pounded their factories to rubble. Fuel trucks sat empty. Replacement parts became memories. The hunters of 1940 had become the hunted of late 1944. Young pilots climbed into cockpits, knowing they might never return. Each mission was a gamble with death itself. The veterans felt it worst. These men had ruled European skies since the war began. They had been artists of aerial combat, masters who painted the clouds with victory after victory. Now, silver wolves stalked them. P-51 Mustangs dove from above like mechanical predators. P-47 Thunderbolts hammered them with overwhelming firepower. The change cut deep into their pride. Skill meant nothing against endless American production. An ace with 50 kills could not match a factory that built 50 fighters in one day. America's industrial machine had crushed German craftsmanship through sheer numbers. Quality bent under the weight of quantity. Excellence drowned in a flood of adequate aircraft. Among the wreckage of German aviation stood one man. Hans Fiffleirs possessed knowledge beyond ordinary pilots. He was a test pilot and engineer. He had coaxed Hitler's jet dream into reality. The Me-262 existed because of his work. He knew every strength hidden in German aircraft. He understood every fatal weakness that plagued their designs. He carried the technical secrets of an entire air force in his mind. But those secrets meant nothing now. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Industry collapsed under Allied bombing. Berlin issued impossible orders while reality crumbled around them. On December 14, 1944, Hans climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The fighter had once been Germany's sword of conquest. Now it groaned with age and fatigue. Metal stressed beyond its limits. This was no mission of glory. No chance for heroic combat. Just a desperate test flight to keep dying aircraft operational. He lifted off into gray winter sky. Then silence struck. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. The propeller stopped turning. The Messerschmitt became a glider with no options. Hans faced those three choices again. Crash into German territory, risk the court-martial, or attempt something unthinkable. He chose the third path, the most dangerous path. Hans angled his powerless fighter beyond German lines. He glided over the shattered remains of Wehrmacht positions. He passed smoking ruins where Allied shells had fallen. His aircraft drifted down toward a muddy field behind American lines. This was not panic. This was calculation. Hans knew Americans would follow Geneva Convention rules. Unlike the fanatics in Berlin, They would treat prisoners according to law. But he carried something far more valuable than his own life. His aircraft was nearly intact. His mind held the skeleton keys to German aviation. Every secret the Luftwaffe possessed lived inside his skull. American soldiers rushed toward the landed fighter. They expected to capture one more defeated pilot. Instead, they had seized a vault of enemy knowledge. The man climbing from that cockpit was worth more than any weapon. Hell's gates should have opened for Hans that day. Fire and death should have claimed him. Instead, he found something impossible: opportunity disguised as surrender. The moment he stepped from his crippled Bf-109, everything changed. His value was no longer measured in aerial victories. Knowledge became his currency. Every detail about German aviation collapse was worth its weight in gold. The Americans moved quickly. No parades, no prison camps. Hans was delivered straight to the Air Technical Service Command. These men collected enemy science and transformed it into American advantage. They did not wear combat ribbons. They wore the faces of engineers and scientists, test pilots who understood the future. These men knew war's ending would not be decided in trenches alone. Victory belonged to laboratories, to workshops, to airfields where ideas either soared or crashed. By late 1944, Allied forces controlled European skies, but they had seen the blur of Me-262s. They heard whispers of rocket fighters. They knew ballistic missiles were coming. Victory came from numbers and reliability, not brilliant design. Yet they also understood war was changing shape. The old doctrine was simple, overwhelming production. The new doctrine carried sharper edges. Understand the enemy. Dismantle their genius. Ensure the future belonged to America. Hans became the perfect weapon for this doctrine. He was not just another prisoner. He was a mirror reflecting every weakness in German aviation. He had fought Mustangs in deadly combat. He had danced with thunderbolts above burning cities. He knew where American claws cut deepest. He understood where their armor cracked under pressure. His knowledge was priceless intelligence, wrapped in human form. Colonel Harold Watson directed Operation Lusty. He saw Hans's value immediately. This was not a Nazi to be locked away. This was a mind that history had delivered into American hands. For the battles to come, America needed answers. Jet would fight jet. Nation would challenge nation. They had to understand why German brilliance failed. They had to prevent their own genius from making the same mistakes. Hans provided answers no interrogation could extract. His words carried the weight of bitter experience. The Me-262 did not fail because of speed, he explained. It died from fuel starvation. It died because German metals could not handle the heat. It died because Jumo 004 engines destroyed themselves after 25 hours of operation. This confession was worth more than capturing intact aircraft. It revealed the fracture lines inside Hitler's empire. Brilliance had been crushed under impossible demands, broken logistics, fanatical orders from madmen. The contrast made Hans's choice unforgettable. Other German pilots chose death over surrender. They flew until flames consumed them. They crashed rather than give enemies satisfaction. Hans chose survival. Not just his own survival, but the survival of knowledge itself, of skill, of aviation as pure science beyond flags and nations. The Americans made him an extraordinary offer, not chains or silence. The chance to fly their machines, to dissect the weapons that had hunted his comrades, to transform enemy strength into his own understanding. He did not accept from American loyalty. He accepted from loyalty to flight itself, to the science of wings and engines, a passion greater than nationalism, greater than warfare. But allowing a Luftwaffe officer into American cockpits required unprecedented boldness. They were handing him controls of the P-51 Mustang, the very predator that had shredded his world. History had never witnessed such an act of calculated trust. The stage was prepared. The hunter would fly with his former prey. From that collision of enemies, something extraordinary would emerge. Winter light shimmered across the runway. Weeks had passed since Hans surrendered himself and his aircraft. Now he was being escorted to another cockpit. Not German this time. American. The North American P-51 Mustang waited. The weapon that had slaughtered his comrades. Irony dripped from every moment. The hunter had become the test subject. Hans climbed the ladder. His hand touched metal that felt completely foreign. The Bf-109 had been a knife, compact and brutal, always balanced on the edge of stalling or surging forward. The Mustang was different, spacious, smooth, almost luxurious compared to German fighters. The canopy offered a panoramic view instead of narrow slits. The cockpit was arranged with cold industrial precision, not the desperate improvisation of a dying empire. He strapped himself in, pressed the throttle forward. The Packard Merlin engine came alive with a deep growl, steady and reliable. Nothing like the coughing, temperamental heart of the DB605 engine. The Mustang rolled down the runway. It leaped into the sky with confident power. Hans felt what his enemies had always felt, the certainty of machinery that did not falter under stress. But this was no recreational flight. This was an autopsy conducted in midair. Hans dissected the machine with every sense he possessed. At altitude, he discovered the secret. Laminar flow wings sliced through air with terrifying efficiency. The Mustang glided at high speed as though invisible rails carried it forward. His old Messerschmitt would have shaken and screamed under such strain. Yet he also found weakness. At low speeds, those same wings betrayed the aircraft. The Mustang grew heavy, sluggish, reluctant to turn in tight circles. A flaw German pilots could exploit in close combat dancing. Then came the revelation about range. Auxiliary fuel tanks stretched the Mustang's reach beyond imagination. Now, Hans understood why Berlin had burned under endless bomber waves. The Mustang was not just a fighter aircraft. It was America's long arm, the guardian that escorted bombers to the Reich's heart and brought them safely home again. Days later, they brought him a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It stood like a mechanical monster, massive and blunt. He called it a flying tank bolted to an engine of 2,000 horsepower. He wrestled the beast into the sky. In turning fights, it was clumsy, doomed against nimble FW-190s. But in a dive, in a screaming plunge of steel and fire, it became unstoppable. 850 caliber guns spat death in concentrated streams. Then the beast climbed back to safety through pure brute force. Hans understood the doctrine. He taught American pilots what he learned. The P-47 was not meant for aerial dueling. It was designed to strike hard, to smash targets, to vanish before enemies could respond. American tactics were being rewritten based on his analysis. He gave Americans insights they could never gain alone. How Luftwaffe aces would drag Mustangs into low-speed traps. How Thunderbolts could be lured into fatal turning fights at treetop height. Every observation he shared was captured in writing. Every movement he described became part of American pilot briefings. Enemy knowledge was being forged into Allied shields. For Hans, this was not treason. This was purity. Flying for the truth of machines, for the science of survival stripped of national colors. But this was only rehearsal. The real test waited across the Atlantic Ocean, in the heart of America itself. There a ghost waited on the runway, the jet he had helped create, the Me-262 now wearing American stars. The stage was shifting from propellers to jets, from survival to destiny. Hans was about to meet the future he had unleashed years earlier. Spring 1945 arrived. Hans crossed the Atlantic Ocean, no longer a prisoner, but a shadow consultant to the United States Army Air Forces. His destination was Freeman Field in Indiana, the vault where America stored plunder from the collapsing Reich. The runway was lined with trophies, Focke-Wulf fighters, Messerschmitt variants, and in the center sat an intact Me-262, the jet he had once created, now repainted with white American stars on its wings. Hans stood motionless for long moments, like facing a ghost returned from the dead. The machine he had raised from blueprints and engineering sweat. The pride of German aviation now served under foreign command. Americans were dazzled by the jet's speed, its futuristic appearance. They saw only the miracle of velocity cutting through air. But Hans knew darker truths hidden beneath sleek metal. The Me-262 was a flawed miracle, a predator that starved while hunting. Jumo 004 engines were fragile as spun glass. They barely lasted 25 hours before tearing themselves apart. Thrust response lagged dangerously. Seconds passed before engines answered throttle commands. Maintenance was a nightmare. Each flight shortened the aircraft's lifespan. Each landing was a gamble with mechanical failure. Yet in its moment of glory, it remained lightning-made manifest. The Americans wanted a demonstration. They staged the unthinkable. Me-262 against their own Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, their firstborn jet, their hope for future skies. Hans climbed once more into the Me-262 cockpit. The space smelled of oil and fading memories. As he lifted into the sky, past collided violently with present. The P-80 rose from below, sleek and sharp, slicing upward with American confidence backing every movement. The Me-262 answered like thunder rolling across the heavens. Side by side they streaked across Indiana sky. Yesterday's ghost racing tomorrow's promise through blue infinity. Hans pushed the German jet hard, showing Americans what their trophy could accomplish. In a dive, the Me-262 screamed faster than any propeller aircraft could dream of matching. But when he advanced throttles for climbing, the jet hesitated, coughing away precious seconds of advantage. The P-80 surged past, slower at maximum velocity, yet steadier, more obedient to pilot commands. From this aerial dance came revelation. Jet combat would never be fought in tight turning circles. Not in the circular death spirals where Spitfires and Messerschmitts had once clashed. The new warfare belonged to vertical dimensions. Dive, strike, escape. The battlefield was no longer a stage for artistic maneuvering. It was a straight line of speed, altitude, and brutal timing precision. Hans carried this message back in reports written with cold accuracy. He showed Americans what to fear, what to repair, what to embrace for the future. The shooting star was not invincible, but it was reliable. That, he told them, was the true key to victory. Reliability would triumph over brilliance every time. Each flight carved invisible breakthroughs in understanding. Each analytical note rewrote American doctrine. From this strange alliance between enemies, the blueprint for future air combat was forged. For Hans, the climax was neither victory nor defeat. It was a reckoning with destiny. His past and present screamed together in the roar of jet engines. German lightning and American fire raced across the sky together. As the jets vanished into the horizon, the old world of aces and dogfights disappeared with them. A new era had arrived. Hans had helped deliver it into American hands. May 1945 brought silence to European guns. For millions, it marked the end of nightmare. For Hans, it was the beginning of permanent exile. He was no longer German, no longer a soldier, no longer even a prisoner of war. He was a man without a nation, haunted by choices, yet indispensable to his captors. The United States understood what lived inside his mind. They offered him not prison bars, but wings. Not enforced silence, but a seat in their laboratories and cockpits. They gave him new identity. Not as conquered enemy, but as specialist, whose experience could accelerate their climb into the jet age by years. Hans accepted their offer. Not from loyalty to foreign flags, but from loyalty to flight itself. He dissected every lesson learned, every weakness discovered, every hidden strength of Germany's fallen Air Force. He poured this knowledge into American doctrine like liquid gold. The hours spent in Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The duels staged with the Me-262. All became foundation stones for machines that would dominate Cold War skies. From his reports, designers drew the path to the F-86 Sabre, the jet that would slash through MiG squadrons over Korean battlefields, hunting them with boom and zoom tactics he had once used against Allied fighters. The irony cut like sharpened steel. German knowledge filtered through a Luftwaffe pilot's mind became the sword of American supremacy in the air. But victory brought no personal peace to Hans himself. To his homeland, he remained a traitor who had vanished into enemy arms. To many Americans, he stayed a Nazi ghost, tolerated, but never truly embraced. Yet among engineers and test pilots, he earned quiet respect. Men like Harold Watson knew the truth. Without Hans, the leap into the jet age would have cost far more blood and treasure. For years he worked in shadows, flying, advising, refining American understanding of aerial warfare. He became part of invisible machinery that built America's new wings for the coming Cold War. By 1950, his journey carried him back to West Germany. Aviation was being rebuilt from atomic ashes there. He continued working in shadows, lending knowledge to both nations, an exile who belonged fully to neither homeland. Hans was not remembered as hero or villain. He became something more unsettling. A man who chose knowledge over loyalty, survival over martyrdom. In making those choices, he shaped the very skies of the modern world. His Bf-109 had not crashed to mark an ending. It had landed to ignite a new chapter of history. That chapter was written in contrasts, stretching into the Cold War, with fingerprints of a forgotten German hand guiding American wings. History remembers victories carved in stone monuments. It forgets the men who made those victories possible while working in silence. Hans was one of those forgotten men. His choice to surrender an intact Messerschmitt, to hand over his own accumulated knowledge. These decisions rewrote the balance of global air power. What he carried across battle lines in December 1944 was not just a broken fighter. It was the blueprint of a dying empire transformed into the foundation of a new one. His legacy was not etched on medals or carved into statue marble. It lived inside the wings of jets that followed. Every lesson he spoke became part of manuals American pilots studied. When F-86 Sabres tore into MiGs above Korean mountains, they flew with ghosts of Luftwaffe tactics, refined, sharpened, perfected by the very man who had once trained to destroy them. The hunter had become the teacher of hunters. But darker threads were woven into that legacy. Hans was not alone in his journey. He was one fragment of Operation Paperclip. That vast program carried hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and pilots into America's shadowy embrace. Together, they injected knowledge that leaped the United States years ahead in jets, missiles, rockets. From fighter wings to the race for space, their fingerprints stretched far beyond 1945's ruins. The contrast remains eternal. To Germany, he was a deserter who turned his back during their darkest hour. To America, he was never fully trusted. Always a foreigner. Always a reminder of enemies they had bled to destroy. But to history itself, he was something stranger. A bridge between two worlds. Between failure and triumph. Between destruction and rebirth through knowledge. Hans proved that loyalty to machinery could outlive loyalty to nations. He showed that a single pilot armed with knowledge instead of guns could alter air combat's destiny for generations to come. His legacy speaks not of glory, but of consequence. A reminder that progress often comes not from heroes or villains, but from those caught in history's cracks, who choose survival and truth above flags and sacred oaths. The Bf-109 that glided across front lines in winter silence did not carry one man alone. It carried seeds of an entire era. An era where jets would decide wars, where nations would rise and fall not on men's courage, but on mastery of machines. Hans vanished into history's shadows, but modern skies still bear his unseen signature, written in contrails and victory. In dying winter of 1944, Hans made a choice few could imagine. He surrendered not just himself, but the very secrets of the Luftwaffe, trading loyalty for survival, nationalism for knowledge. That decision created ripples reaching far beyond his cockpit. It shaped how America entered the jet age. It influenced Korean War battles, where sabers clashed with MiGs. It whispered into Cold War tensions where rockets rose toward space. His story is not one of battlefield heroism, not a tale of medals or victory parades. It is a tale of shadows where survival and betrayal intertwined, where one pilot's mind carried more strategic weight than his aircraft's wings. Hans stood at the crossroads of two collapsing worlds. To Germany, a traitor. To America, a stranger. To history, an enigma wrapped in contradictions. Yet through him, German aviation's legacy bled into American strength, ensuring that 20th century skies were written not by chance, but by calculated knowledge transfer. This remains the haunting truth. Sometimes history's greatest shifts are not made by armies or nations, but by a single man who refuses to die wearing his uniform. The Bf-109 that slid to rest on muddy American soil was not mechanical wreckage. It was a doorway opening into the future. Through that door stepped the Cold War, the jet age, a future forged in fire and hardened steel. Hans, unknown to monuments and absent from textbooks, remains the reminder that wars are decided not only by who fights hardest, but by who dares to hand tomorrow's secrets to yesterday's enemy. In that winter silence, as his fighter came to rest among strangers, he did exactly that. The winter of December 1944 gripped Europe like iron fists around a dying heart. Each exhale from the crumbling Reich rose like desperate smoke signals into skies that had turned deaf to German prayers. Those same heavens that once echoed with the thunder of conquest now witnessed only collapse. What remained of the Luftwaffe resembled a skeleton picked clean by vultures. The mighty aerial armada that had terrorized Europe in the opening years of war now lay scattered across frozen airfields. Twisted metal and shattered dreams littered runways like broken teeth. The predators of 1939 had become prey by 1944. Young German pilots climbed into cockpits knowing each takeoff might be their final breath. Their hands trembled on control sticks. Their hearts hammered against ribs as engines coughed to life. Death had become their constant companion. Every mission felt like spinning a loaded chamber in Russian roulette. The seasoned aces suffered differently. These masters of aerial combat had ruled the clouds since September 1939. They remembered when Messerschmitts dove like eagles upon helpless prey. They had been artists painting victory across blue canvases with tracers and smoke. Now humiliation burned in their throats like acid. These veterans watched their domain crumble piece by piece. Silver American Mustangs prowled German skies like wolves hunting wounded deer. Thunderbolts struck from above, with the weight of falling hammers. The hunters had learned to cower from their former prey. Skill no longer mattered against America's endless production lines. An ace with 50 kills counted for less than assembly workers churning out 50 fresh fighters daily. Individual brilliance withered before industrial might. The personal touch of craftsmanship died beneath mass production's cold efficiency. Into this maelstrom of destruction stepped one man whose name would echo through aviation history. Hans Fiffleirs emerged from the chaos carrying secrets that could reshape the future of flight itself. This was no ordinary pilot seeking glory in aerial combat. Lers possessed a mind that understood machinery the way poets understood words. He was part test pilot and part engineer. His fingers could coax life from dying engines. His eyes saw flaws invisible to others. Most importantly, he had breathed life into Hitler's most ambitious aerial dream. The Messerschmitt Me 262 owed its existence to men like Lers. This revolutionary jet fighter represented Germany's last hope for air superiority. Its twin engines promised speeds no propeller aircraft could match. Its sleek design cut through air like a sword through silk. Yet Lers knew what others refused to see. The Me 262 was brilliant, but fatally flawed. Its engines devoured themselves after mere hours of flight. Fuel shortages strangled its potential. Manufacturing defects plagued every component. German industry was collapsing faster than dreams could sustain it. On the morning of December 14, 1944, Lers prepared for what would become his most fateful flight. He walked across frozen concrete toward a waiting Messerschmitt Bf 109. This single-engine fighter had once been the sharp spear of German conquest. Now it groaned with metal fatigue and mechanical exhaustion. The Bf 109, sitting before him, bore scars of countless battles. Bullet holes had been patched with makeshift repairs. Its paint was chipped and faded. The engine ran rough and irregular. Everything about the aircraft screamed desperation. This was not a mission of conquest or glory. Technical necessity drove this flight. The Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft needed evaluation and maintenance. Someone had to keep these aging machines airborne against impossible odds. Lers had drawn that thankless duty. He climbed into the narrow cockpit and felt the familiar embrace of worn leather and cold metal. His hands moved through pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. The engine turned over reluctantly. Oil pressure fluctuated erratically. Fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. The takeoff proceeded without incident. The Bf 109 lifted from German soil and climbed into gray winter skies. Below, the landscape showed nothing but destruction. Bomb craters dotted the countryside like smallpox scars. Smoke columns marked the graves of burning cities. Then disaster struck without warning. The engine coughed once and fell silent. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Suddenly, Fiffleirs found himself piloting a powerless glider 30,000 feet above a battlefield. Three options presented themselves in those terrifying seconds. He could attempt a crash landing in German territory and hope to crawl from the wreckage alive. He could bail out and parachute into friendly hands, but face court-martial for losing precious equipment. Or he could choose the unthinkable. Fiffleirs made his decision with the cold calculation of an engineer. He angled the dying fighter away from German lines. The aircraft glided silently over battle-scarred terrain. Artillery smoke drifted below like morning fog. The front lines appeared as brown scars cutting across the frozen earth. He guided the powerless Messerschmitt deeper into Allied territory. His hands remained steady on the controls. His breathing stayed calm and measured. This was not panic, but careful planning. Every mile carried him further from German forces and closer to American positions. The landing site appeared ahead like a muddy brown carpet. Fiffleirs lined up his approach with the precision of a master pilot. The Bf-109 touched down in a plowed field behind American lines. Dirt and snow sprayed from the landing gear as the aircraft rolled to a stop. This was not luck, but calculated strategy. Fiffleirs understood something his fellow Germans had forgotten. The Americans followed Geneva Convention rules. They treated prisoners according to international law. More importantly, they valued intelligence above revenge. What Fiffleirs carried in his mind was worth more than gold. He possessed intimate knowledge of every German aircraft in production. He knew their strengths and fatal weaknesses. He understood manufacturing processes and design philosophies. Most crucially, he held the secrets of jet propulsion. American soldiers surrounded the downed aircraft within minutes. They approached cautiously, with weapons ready. The pilot who emerged from the cockpit looked calm and composed. His hands were raised, but his posture showed no fear. This man had chosen surrender deliberately. The soldiers who captured Fiffleirs had no idea what prize had fallen into their hands. They saw only another German pilot in another crashed fighter. They processed him like any other prisoner of war. Forms were filled out. Personal effects were catalogued. Medical examinations were conducted. But word traveled quickly up the chain of command. Intelligence officers recognized the value of what they had captured. This was not just another Luftwaffe pilot. This was a test pilot with intimate knowledge of Germany's most advanced aircraft. The man who had helped birth the jet age. Fiffleirs found himself transported not to a prison camp, but to specialized facilities. American intelligence officers began the delicate process of extracting information from his mind. They approached him not as an enemy, but as a valuable technical consultant. The questioning began immediately, but proceeded with surprising courtesy. The Americans wanted to understand German aircraft capabilities. They needed to know about production methods and design philosophies. Most importantly, they craved details about jet engine technology. Fiffleirs cooperated fully with his captors. He answered their questions with technical precision. He drew diagrams of aircraft systems. He explained manufacturing processes in minute detail. His cooperation was complete and voluntary. This was not betrayal in his mind, but scientific exchange. Aviation technology belonged to no single nation. Knowledge should serve the advancement of flight itself. Political boundaries meant nothing when measured against the pure science of aerodynamics and propulsion. The Americans quickly realized what treasure had fallen into their possession. Here was a man who could explain every aspect of German aviation. He understood not just how their aircraft worked, but why they failed. His knowledge could save American lives and shorten the war. By early 1945, Fiffleirs had become an unofficial consultant to American air forces. He briefed intelligence officers on German tactics and capabilities. He reviewed captured aircraft and explained their systems. His insights proved invaluable for Allied operations. But the real tests were yet to come. The Americans wanted more than just technical briefings. They wanted practical demonstrations. They needed to understand how German aircraft actually performed in flight. Most importantly, they wanted comparative evaluations against American fighters. The proposal was unprecedented in military history. They wanted to put a former enemy pilot in the cockpit of American fighters. They would allow him to fly the very aircraft that had been hunting his comrades. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. Fiffleirs accepted the offer without hesitation. This was an opportunity no test pilot could refuse. He would have the chance to evaluate the machines that had destroyed German air power. Scientific curiosity overcame any lingering loyalty to his former nation. The first aircraft they gave him was a North American P-51 Mustang. This sleek fighter had become the scourge of German skies. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers deep into the Reich. Its performance had proven superior to most German fighters. Climbing into the Mustang's cockpit felt like entering an alien world. Everything was different from German design philosophy. The Americans favored spaciousness over compactness, comfort over Spartanism, reliability over raw performance. The Mustang's cockpit offered panoramic visibility through its bubble canopy. German fighters used narrow greenhouse canopies that restricted the pilot's view. The American approach prioritized situational awareness over structural strength. Starting the Packard Merlin engine revealed another philosophical difference. The American engine ran smooth and steady from initial startup. German engines typically required careful warming and constant attention. The Mustang's power plant seemed almost boringly reliable. Rolling down the runway and lifting into American skies, Fiffleirs felt the Mustang's true character emerge. The aircraft flew with effortless grace. Its controls responded precisely to pilot inputs. Everything felt smooth and predictable. At altitude, the Mustang's advantages became crystal clear. Its laminar flow wings cut through air with incredible efficiency. The fighter maintained high speeds without the vibration and buffeting that plagued German aircraft. It was like flying on invisible rails. But Fiffleirs also discovered weaknesses his former comrades could have exploited. At low speeds, the same laminar flow wings became sluggish and unresponsive. The Mustang lost agility in tight turning battles. A skilled German pilot could potentially trap one in a low-speed knife fight. The revelation of range proved most shocking. With auxiliary fuel tanks, the Mustang could fly deeper into enemy territory than any German fighter could follow. This explained how American bombers had penetrated to Berlin's heart, while their escorts returned home safely. Days later, the Americans presented him with their other premier fighter. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stood like a metallic mountain beside the graceful Mustang. This massive aircraft looked more like a flying tank than an elegant fighter. Climbing into the Thunderbolt's cockpit required physical effort. The aircraft was enormous compared to any German fighter. Its radial engine displaced over 2,800 cubic inches. The propeller measured nearly 13 feet across. Everything about it screamed raw power over finesse. Taking off in the Thunderbolt felt like launching a projectile from a cannon. The huge radial engine generated tremendous torque. The aircraft wanted to roll inverted during the takeoff run. Only constant pressure on the rudder pedals kept it tracking straight. Once airborne, the Thunderbolt's true nature emerged. In level flight, it was fast but ungainly. Its massive bulk made tight turns impossible. Any German fighter could outmaneuver it, in horizontal combat. But the Thunderbolt was not designed for turning battles. In a dive, the massive fighter transformed into something terrifying. Its weight and power created devastating diving attacks. The 850 caliber machine guns could shred any target. More importantly, the Thunderbolt could climb back to safety using pure brute force. Fiffleirs understood immediately. This was not an aircraft designed for aerial dueling. It was a weapon system optimized for hit-and-run attacks. Strike from above, destroy the target, escape before retaliation was possible. The tactics were as brutal as the machine itself. His evaluations provided the Americans with insights no amount of combat reports could reveal. He explained how German pilots would attempt to trap Mustangs in low-speed battles. He showed where Thunderbolts were vulnerable to coordinated attacks. Every weakness he identified was immediately incorporated into pilot training programs. For Fiffleirs, these flights represented pure scientific investigation. He was not betraying his former nation, but advancing the science of aviation. Political loyalties seemed petty compared to the pursuit of aerodynamic truth. Knowledge belonged to humanity, not to individual countries. The Americans recognized the value of his contributions. His reports influenced fighter tactics and training programs. His insights helped American pilots survive encounters with increasingly desperate German aces. The knowledge flowed directly from cockpit to classroom to combat. But this was merely preparation for the ultimate test. Across the Atlantic, a ghost from his past waited on an American runway. The Messerschmitt, Me-262, he had helped create, now wore American star insignia. The jet age was about to begin its most important evaluation. Spring 1945 brought Hans Fiffleirs across the Atlantic Ocean to American soil. He traveled not as a prisoner, but as a technical consultant whose expertise had proven invaluable. His destination was Freeman Field in Indiana, a facility that housed the most sensitive aviation secrets of the war. The airfield resembled a museum of captured aircraft. German fighters lined the runways like trophies from a successful hunt. Focke-Wulf 190s sat beside Messerschmitt, Bf 109s. Junkers bombers towered over smaller fighters. Each aircraft told a story of German defeat and American victory. But in the center of this aerial graveyard stood something that made Fiffleirs' heart skip. An intact Messerschmitt. Me-262 gleamed in the Indiana sunlight. The revolutionary jet fighter he had helped birth now bore white American stars on its wings and fuselage. For several long moments, he simply stared at the aircraft. Memories flooded back of countless hours spent in development and testing. This sleek machine represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology. It had been their hope for regaining air superiority. The Americans had repainted the jet, but otherwise left it untouched. Its twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines still hung beneath swept wings. The tricycle landing gear remained fully functional. Even the cockpit instruments were in their original German configuration. American engineers and test pilots gathered around the aircraft like students around a master's workbench. They asked endless questions about systems and procedures. How did the engines start? What were the flight characteristics? Where were the weaknesses they should know about? Fiffleirs answered each question with technical precision. He explained that the Me-262 was indeed a revolutionary design, but also fatally flawed. Its engines were mechanical marvels that destroyed themselves through their own power. The Jumo 04 turbojets rarely lasted more than 25 hours of operation. The engines also suffered from throttle lag that could prove fatal in combat. When a pilot pushed the throttle forward, several seconds passed before the engines responded with increased power. Those precious seconds often meant the difference between life and death in aerial combat. Fuel consumption was another critical weakness. The Me-262 burned aviation gasoline at prodigious rates. Its range was severely limited compared to propeller-driven fighters. Many combat missions ended with desperate glides back to base on empty tanks. But despite these limitations, the Me-262 remained a formidable weapon when properly employed. Its speed advantage over propeller aircraft was overwhelming. No Allied fighter could catch a Me-262 in level flight. Hit-and-run attacks were virtually unstoppable. The Americans wanted to stage the ultimate comparison. They brought out their own first-generation jet fighter, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. This sleek aircraft represented American hopes for dominating future air combat. A direct confrontation would reveal which design philosophy would rule the coming jet age. Climbing back into the Me-262's cockpit felt like returning home after a long journey. Every switch and lever occupied its familiar position. The instrument panel displayed information in the same German format he remembered. Even the smell of oil and metal brought back memories. Starting the Jumo engines required careful attention to procedures. Too much throttle would cause a compressor stall. Too little would result in a hung start. The engines had to be nursed to life like temperamental racehorses. American jets used simpler, more reliable starting procedures. As the Me-262 taxied toward the runway, Fiffleirs felt the familiar vibration of the turbojet engines. The aircraft wanted to dart forward like a greyhound on a leash. Only careful throttle control kept the taxi speed reasonable. This was a thoroughbred that demanded respect. The takeoff proved smooth and powerful. The Me-262 accelerated down the runway with authority. Its tricycle landing gear provided excellent directional control. Within seconds, the jet was climbing through Indiana skies at angles no propeller aircraft could match. The P-80 Shooting Star followed close behind. American test pilots wanted to compare the two jets in direct flight. Side by side, the aircraft represented two different approaches to the same technological challenge. German innovation versus American engineering philosophy. In level flight, the Me-262 held a slight speed advantage. Its swept wings cut through air more efficiently than the P-80's straight wings. But the American jet demonstrated superior throttle response and engine reliability. When power was demanded, the P-80 delivered immediately. The true test came in simulated combat maneuvers. The Me-262 could accelerate away from any attack with devastating effectiveness. But when it needed to climb quickly or change direction rapidly, the throttle lag became apparent. Those crucial seconds of delay could prove fatal against a responsive opponent. The P-80 showed different characteristics. It was slightly slower in maximum speed, but far more predictable in its responses. American pilots could rely on their engines to deliver power exactly when needed. This reliability translated into tactical advantages in fluid combat situations. From these comparative flights emerged the blueprint for future jet combat doctrine. The old days of turning dogfights were ending. Jet combat would be fought in the vertical plane through diving attacks and climbing escapes. Speed and altitude would matter more than agility and turning radius. The implications stretched far beyond individual aircraft performance. Air combat was evolving from an art form practiced by skilled individuals into a science dependent on superior technology. The pilot's skill would always matter, but the machine's capabilities were becoming increasingly dominant. Fiffleirs documented every aspect of these comparative evaluations. His reports analyzed strengths and weaknesses with scientific objectivity. He showed American engineers where their designs excelled and where improvements were needed. The knowledge flowed directly into future aircraft development programs. The summer of 1945 brought Germany's final surrender, and the end of European combat. For millions of people, this meant the beginning of peace and reconstruction. For Hans Fiffleirs, it marked the start of a different kind of exile. He was no longer a German officer or an American prisoner. His status had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. He had become a stateless technical consultant whose knowledge transcended national boundaries. Aviation science had become his only true homeland. The Americans offered him permanent employment within their aircraft development programs. They needed his expertise to accelerate their entry into the jet age. Soviet Russia was already developing advanced aircraft using captured German technology. The Cold War was beginning even as the Hot War ended. Fiffleirs accepted their offer without hesitation. This was an opportunity to continue working at the cutting edge of aviation technology. Political considerations seemed irrelevant compared to the chance to advance human flight capabilities. Science belonged to all humanity, not to individual nations. His integration into American programs proceeded smoothly. Engineers and test pilots quickly recognized his technical competence. Former enemies became colleagues united by shared passion for aviation excellence. Professional respect transcended wartime hatreds and national prejudices. The knowledge he brought proved invaluable for American aircraft development. His insights into German design philosophy influenced the next generation of American fighters. The F-86 Sabre, which would dominate Korean War skies, incorporated lessons learned from Messerschmitt design principles. But the personal cost was severe. To his former homeland, he had become a traitor who sold German secrets to the enemy. Family members and former colleagues shunned his memory. His name was erased from official histories and technical documents. Many Americans also viewed him with suspicion. Despite his valuable contributions, he remained a former Nazi officer in their minds. Trust came slowly and often incompletely. He existed in a gray zone between acceptance and rejection. Yet, among aviation professionals, his reputation grew steadily. Test pilots and engineers judged him by his technical competence rather than his political past. His contributions to American aviation were recognized and valued by those who understood their significance. By 1950, his influence extended far beyond individual aircraft designs. His insights into high-speed flight characteristics helped shape American supersonic research programs. His understanding of jet engine technology accelerated American power plant development. His tactical analyses influenced pilot training and combat doctrine. The irony was profound. German aviation knowledge, filtered through the mind of a Luftwaffe test pilot, became the foundation for American air superiority. The nation that had been Germany's mortal enemy now flew aircraft incorporating German design principles. When the Korean War erupted, American F-86 Sabres dominated Soviet-built MiG-15s using tactics derived from Luftwaffe experience. The boom and zoom attacks that Fiffleirs had once used against Allied bombers became standard doctrine for American pilots fighting communist forces. His personal story faded into classified files and forgotten archives. Official histories rarely mentioned his contributions. The public never learned how a single German pilot had helped shape American aviation dominance. His legacy lived on in the aircraft themselves, rather than in monuments or memorials. In his later years, Fiffleirs worked quietly in both American and German aviation programs. The rebuilding of German aircraft industry offered him a chance to return home, but the homecoming was neither complete nor entirely satisfying. Too much had changed for reconciliation to be simple. The man who had once surrendered his Messerschmitt to American forces became a bridge between former enemies. His technical knowledge helped both nations develop superior aircraft. His choice to prioritize scientific advancement over national loyalty created benefits that outlasted political conflicts. History tends to remember dramatic battles and heroic sacrifices. It often overlooks the quiet contributions of individuals who shaped events from behind the scenes. Hans Fiffleirs fell into this second category, influential but largely invisible to public awareness. His decision to land that crippled Bf-109 behind American lines in December 1944 had consequences that echoed through decades of aviation development. What began as a desperate emergency landing became a pivotal moment in the transfer of technology from one nation to another. The knowledge he carried in his mind proved more valuable than any single aircraft or weapon system. His understanding of German aviation strengths and weaknesses provided American engineers with insights that accelerated their technological development by years. The Cold War might have evolved very differently without his contributions, yet the moral complexity of his choice continues to resist simple judgment. Was he a traitor who betrayed his nation for personal survival? Or was he a scientist who placed human knowledge above political boundaries? The answer depends on which values one considers most important. What remains undeniable is the practical impact of his decision. American aviation supremacy in the early jet age owed much to the knowledge he provided. The aircraft that dominated post-war skies incorporated lessons learned from his technical analyses and flight evaluations. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 that glided across battle lines in 1944 carried more than just a desperate pilot. It transported the seeds of a technological revolution that would reshape military aviation for generations. In choosing survival over martyrdom, Hans Fiffleirs changed the course of aerospace history. His story serves as a reminder that history's most important moments often occur in shadows rather than spotlights. The quiet transfer of knowledge between former enemies sometimes matters more than spectacular victories or defeats. Science and technology recognize no national boundaries. The young German who climbed from his crashed fighter in that frozen field could not have imagined the consequences of his choice. But the future of flight was forever altered by his decision to surrender his aircraft intact and share his knowledge willingly with former enemies. The masters of aerial warfare had transformed into hunted prey. These warriors who once carved deadly patterns across European skies with their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now found themselves stalked relentlessly. Silver-winged P-51 Mustangs prowled like wolves above them. Thunderbolts hammered down like armored fists from heaven. The reversal cut deep into their souls. Technical mastery meant nothing now. Years of training dissolved under America's industrial might. An ace pilot with 50 victories counted for less than the factory that rolled 50 fresh fighters off production lines in 24 hours. In this catastrophe of falling steel and burning pride, one figure emerged from the chaos. Hans Fiffleirs stood apart from ordinary aces. This man understood machinery from its bones outward. He was more than a pilot. Engineering flowed through his veins like blood. The revolutionary Me-262 jet had risen to life under his hands. Every bolt and wire held secrets he had mastered. He represented the final spark of German aviation genius. That spark flickered weakly now. Fuel shortages strangled engines. Factories crumbled under endless bombardment. Madness poured from Berlin's bunkers like poison. December 14, 1944, arrived cold and gray. Fiffleirs pulled himself into a Messerschmitt Bf-109 cockpit one final time. The fighter that once speared through enemy formations now wheezed with mechanical exhaustion. Metal fatigue showed in every rivet. This flight carried no glory. Only desperation drove him skyward. Technical necessity demanded this mission. The Luftwaffe's dying breath needed testing. Then silence swallowed everything. The engine coughed once, twice. Metal components seized inside the cowling. The propeller windmilled uselessly in frigid air. His Messerschmitt became a glider drifting through winter clouds. 3 paths opened before him like doorways to different fates. He could crash land in German territory. Hope crawled from twisted wreckage. Pray the impact didn't kill him instantly. Or bail out with his parachute. Float down among his own soldiers. Face court-martial for losing precious aircraft. Steel was more valuable than pilots now. The third choice seemed impossible. Hans Fiffleirs chose impossibility. He banked the powerless fighter toward enemy lines, past Wehrmacht positions torn by artillery, over ruins smoking under Allied shells. The dead Messerschmitt glided down toward muddy American territory. This was not luck guiding his hands. Cold calculation steered every movement. Fiffleirs understood Americans would honor Geneva Convention rules. Berlin's propaganda meant nothing to them. More importantly, he carried treasures beyond his own survival. This intact Messerschmitt represented intelligence gold. His mind held keys to every Luftwaffe secret. When American soldiers rushed toward the crashed fighter, they captured more than a defeated pilot. They seized a living library of German aviation knowledge. Hell's gates had opened for Hans Fiffleirs. But instead of flames and death, opportunity waited inside. No longer just another pilot. He had become a prize beyond measure. The only question burning now was simple. What would Americans do with such a gift? Hans Fiffleirs didn't touch Earth that December day. He landed in the center of an intelligence battlefield. The moment his boots hit muddy ground beside the crippled Bf-109, his value shifted completely. Kill counts meant nothing now. Knowledge measured worth. Every detail about Germany's collapsing air industry lived inside his skull. American forces moved him quickly through secure channels. No parades celebrated his capture. No prison cells awaited him. Instead, the Air Technical Service Command claimed their prize. This secretive organization gathered enemy technology fragments. They forged captured science into American advantages. The men who received Fiffleirs wore no combat ribbons on their uniforms. Engineer faces stared back at him. Scientists and test pilots understood warfare's true nature. Victory would not be written only in trenches, not decided purely by bombing runs over cities. Laboratories would determine outcomes. Workshops held the keys to triumph. Airfields where ideas either soared or crashed would shape tomorrow. Allied forces owned European skies by late 1944, yet they harbored no illusions about their superiority. The blur of Me-262 jets had shocked them. Whispers of rocket fighters chilled their blood. Ballistic missiles seemed like science fiction nightmares. They knew their victory came from overwhelming numbers, from reliable production lines, not from brilliant design innovations, but they also recognized war was evolving rapidly, transforming into something entirely new. Old doctrine was brutally simple. Drown enemies under endless production, bury them in steel and aluminum. The new doctrine, born from fear of German innovation, demanded sharper thinking. Understand your enemy completely. Dismantle their genius piece by piece. Ensure the future belongs to America alone. Hans Fiffleirs became the perfect instrument for this philosophy. He was not just another prisoner filling camp rosters. He was a mirror reflecting every weakness in German aviation. He had fought against Mustangs in deadly aerial dances. He had dodged thunderbolts diving like metal hawks. He knew where their claws cut deepest, where their armor showed cracks under pressure. Colonel Harold Watson, the man directing Operation Lusty, saw the truth immediately. He didn't look at Lurse as a Nazi enemy. He saw a mind that history itself had delivered. For the battles ahead, jet against jet conflicts, nation against nation struggles, America needed understanding. Why had German brilliance failed so completely? How could they prevent their own innovations from similar collapse? Lurse provided answers no interrogation could extract through force. The Me-262 didn't die because of insufficient speed, he stated with cold precision. It died from fuel starvation choking its engines. It died because our metals couldn't withstand extreme heat. It died because Jumo 004 engines destroyed themselves after 25 operating hours. This confession carried more value than any captured fighter aircraft. It sketched fracture lines throughout Hitler's steel empire. A vision of brilliance crushed under impossible demands emerged. Broken logistics chains, fanatical orders from madmen in bunkers. Lurse embodied the contrast that made his choice unforgettable. Other German pilots chose death over surrender. They flew into hopeless battles rather than submit. Hans Lurse chose survival instead. Of knowledge, of skill, of aviation science itself. Americans made him an extraordinary offer. Not chains around his wrists, not enforced silence in dark cells, but opportunities to climb into their cockpits, to dissect weapons that had hunted his comrades, to transform enemy strength into his own understanding. He didn't accept from loyalty to America's cause. He accepted from loyalty to flight itself, to the pure science of wings and engines, a passion transcending flags and nations. Yet allowing a Luftwaffe officer into a P-51 Mustang cockpit seemed insane. Handing him controls of the very predator that had shredded his world required unprecedented boldness. History had never witnessed such audacious cooperation. The stage was prepared now. Germany's hunter would fly alongside Germany's killers. In that collision of former enemies, something extraordinary would be born. Winter light shimmered across the runway surface. Weeks had passed since Hans Lurse surrendered himself and his aircraft. Now he found himself escorted back toward a cockpit. Not of a German fighter this time, but of the weapon that had slaughtered his comrades mercilessly. The North American P-51 Mustang waited like a metallic predator. Irony drenched this moment completely. The hunter had become the test subject. The killer of Messerschmitts now trusted the very man who once swore to destroy it. Lurse climbed the ladder slowly. His fingers brushed alien metal surfaces. The Bf-109 he knew intimately was a knife, compact and brutal, always balanced on the edge of stalling or surging forward. The Mustang felt entirely different under his hands. Spacious cockpit surrounded him. Smooth controls responded to gentle touches, almost luxurious compared to German improvisation. Its canopy offered panoramic views, not the narrow slit he was accustomed to. The cockpit arrangement showed cold industrial precision, not the desperate improvisation of a dying Reich. He strapped himself in carefully, pressed the throttle forward tentatively. The Packard Merlin engine growled to life, deep and steady vibrations, unlike the coughing, temperamental heart of the DB605 engine. As the Mustang rolled down the runway and leaped into sky, Lurse felt what his enemies had experienced, the certainty of power that never faltered under stress. Yet this was no recreational joyride through clouds. This represented an autopsy conducted in flight. Lurse dissected the machine with every sense he possessed. At altitude, the secret revealed itself clearly. Laminar flow wings sliced through air with terrifying efficiency. The Mustang glided at high speeds as though invisible rails carried it forward. His old Messerschmitt would have shaken violently, screaming under such strain. But weaknesses also became apparent to his experienced eye. At low speeds, those same wings betrayed the Mustang completely. The aircraft grew heavy and sluggish, reluctant to respond to turning commands, a flaw German pilots could exploit during close combat dancing. Then came the revelation of extraordinary range capabilities. Auxiliary fuel tanks stretched its reach beyond imagination. Now, Lurcy understood why Berlin had burned under endless bomber waves. The Mustang was not merely a fighter aircraft, it was America's long-reaching arm, the guardian that escorted bombers to the Reich's heart and brought them safely home again. Days later, they presented him with a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It stood like an iron monster on the tarmac, massive and blunt in every line. He called it a flying tank, bolted to an engine producing 2,000 horsepower. He wrestled the beast into the sky with considerable effort. In turning fights, it proved clumsy beyond belief, certain doom against nimble FW-190 opponents. But in diving attacks, screaming plunges of steel and fire, it became utterly unstoppable. 850 caliber guns spat streams of death. Then the beast climbed back to safety through sheer brute force. Lurcy understood the philosophy immediately. The P-47 was not designed for dancing duels. It was meant to strike hard, to smash targets completely, to vanish before enemies could retaliate effectively. He provided Americans with insights they could never have discovered alone. How Luftwaffe aces would drag Mustangs into low-speed traps. How Thunderbolts could be lured into fatal turning fights at treetop height. Every observation he shared, every tactical movement he described, was captured meticulously, written into briefings for American pilots to study. Enemy knowledge was forged into their protective shield. For Lurcy, this represented no treason against his homeland. This was purity in its highest form, flying for the truth of machines themselves, for the science of aerial survival. Yet this was only rehearsal for the main performance. The real test waited across the ocean, in America's heartland. There, a ghost awaited him on the runway. The jet he had once given birth to, the Me-262, now wearing American stars. The stage was shifting from propellers to jets, from mere survival to ultimate destiny. Spring 1945 arrived with promise and uncertainty. Hans Lurcy crossed the Atlantic Ocean, no longer a prisoner in shackles, but a shadow consultant for the United States Army Air Forces. His destination was Freeman Field, Indiana, the vault where America stored plunder from a collapsing Reich. Here, runways were lined with trophy aircraft. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts stood in neat rows. In the center, an intact Me-262 waited. The jet that had once been his creation, now repainted with white stars on swept wings. For a long moment, Lurcy stood perfectly still, like facing a ghost from his past. The machine he had raised from blueprints and sweat, the pride of German aviation, now stood under foreign command and control. Americans were dazzled by its revolutionary speed. Its futuristic shape seemed decades ahead of anything else. They saw only the miracle of pure velocity. But Lurcy knew the darker truths hidden inside. The Me-262 was a flawed miracle, a starving predator on the hunt. Its Jumo 044 engines, fragile as spun glass, barely lasted 25 hours, before tearing themselves apart catastrophically. Thrust response lagged dangerously, stumbling seconds before answering throttle commands. Maintenance was a continuing nightmare. Each flight shortened its operational life. Each landing became a gamble with death. And yet, in its brief moments of glory, it remained pure lightning. Americans wanted to witness a duel between eras, so they staged the unthinkable confrontation, Me-262, against their own Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, their firstborn jet offspring, their hope for dominating skies to come. Fiffleirs climbed once more into the Me-262 cockpit. The interior smelled of oil and fading memories. As he lifted into the sky, past collided violently with present. The P-80 approached from below the horizon, sleek and sharp like a steel arrow, slicing upward with American confidence and power. The Me-262 answered like rolling thunder. Side by side, they streaked across Indiana sky. Yesterday's ghost racing tomorrow's promise. Fiffleirs pushed the German jet hard, showing Americans what it could accomplish. In diving attacks, the Me-262 screamed faster than any propeller could dream of reaching. But when he throttled up for climbing maneuvers, the jet hesitated noticeably, coughing away precious seconds of advantage. The P-80 surged past smoothly, slower at maximum speed perhaps, yet steadier and more obedient to its master's commands. From this aerial dance came crucial revelation. Jet combat would never be fought in tight turning circles. Not in spirals of death where Spitfires and Messerschmitts once clashed. The new warfare belonged to vertical dimensions. Dive, strike with devastating force, escape at high speed. The battlefield was no longer a stage for individual artistry. It had become a straight line of speed calculations, altitude advantages, brutal timing precision. Fiffleirs carried this message back in reports written with surgical precision. He showed Americans what to fear in future conflicts, what to fix in their designs, what to embrace for victory. The shooting star was not invincible in combat, but it was reliable under stress. That, he told them, was the true key to success. Each flight carved invisible breakthroughs in understanding. Each note of his analysis rewrote tactical doctrine completely. Out of this strange alliance between former enemies, blueprints for the future were forged. For Hans Fiffleirs, the climax was neither victory nor defeat. It was a moment of absolute reckoning. His past and present screamed together in roaring engines, German lightning and American fire racing across endless sky. As the jets vanished into distant horizons, the old world of aces and dogfights died with them. A new era had arrived with thunder and flame. Hans Fiffleirs had helped deliver that future personally. May 1945 brought silence to European battlefields. For millions of soldiers and civilians, it marked the end of nightmare. For Hans Fiffleirs, it represented the beginning of lifelong exile. He was no longer German in any meaningful sense, no longer a soldier serving any cause, no longer even a prisoner behind bars. He had become a man without a nation to claim him, haunted by choices made, yet indispensable to his captors. The United States understood what treasures lived inside his mind. They offered him not prison bars and silence, but wings to fly again. Not enforced silence in dark cells, but seats inside their laboratories and cockpits. They provided him with entirely new identity, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a specialist whose experience could accelerate their climb into the jet age. Fiffleirs accepted their offer willingly, not from loyalty to a flag that was not his own, but from loyalty to flight itself. The pure science of aviation transcended all national boundaries. He dissected every lesson learned from defeat, every weakness exposed by collapse, every hidden strength of Germany's fallen Air Force. He poured this knowledge into American doctrine like liquid gold. The hours spent in Mustangs and Thunderbolts became foundational. The duels staged with the Me-262 jet became textbook examples. All of this became the foundation for machines that would dominate Cold War skies. From his detailed reports, a clear path was drawn to the F-86 Sabre that would slash through MiG squadrons, over Korean battlefields, hunting them with boom and zoom tactics he once used against Allied fighters. The irony cut like a sharpened blade. German knowledge, filtered through a Luftwaffe pilot's mind, became the sword of American supremacy. But victory in aerial combat brought no personal peace to Lürse himself. To his abandoned homeland, he was a traitor, vanished into enemy arms like a coward. To many Americans, he remained a Nazi ghost, tolerated for his usefulness, but never truly embraced or trusted. Yet among engineers and test pilots, he earned quiet respect. Men like Harold Watson knew the truth. Without Lürse's contributions, the leap into the jet age would have cost far more blood. For years, he worked in shadows and silence, flying experimental aircraft, advising on design improvements, refining tactical concepts. He became part of invisible machinery that built America's new wings. By 1950, his journey carried him back to West Germany, where aviation was being rebuilt from ashes and memories. There, he continued working in shadows, lending knowledge to both nations equally, an exile who belonged fully to neither homeland. Hans Lürse was not remembered as a hero in any history book, not condemned as a villain in any trial, but as something more unsettling to contemplate. A man who chose knowledge over blind loyalty, survival over meaningless martyrdom. In doing so, he shaped the very skies of the modern world. His Bf-109 had not crashed to mark an ending. It had landed to ignite a completely new chapter. That chapter was written in contrasts stretching into Cold War darkness, with fingerprints of a forgotten German hand guiding American wings. History always remembers glorious victories and defeats. It forgets the men who made them possible in silence. Hans Lürse was one of those invisible men. His choice to surrender a Messerschmitt intact, to hand over his own accumulated knowledge freely. This rewrote the entire balance of air power. What he carried across battle lines in December 1944 was not just a broken fighter. It was the blueprint of a dying empire, transformed into the foundation of a new one. Lürse's legacy was not etched on bronze medals, nor carved into marble statues in town squares. It lived inside the wings of jets that followed. Every lesson he had spoken aloud, every flaw he had exposed to scrutiny. These became part of manuals American pilots studied religiously. When F-86 Sabres tore into MiGs above Korea, they flew with ghosts of Luftwaffe tactics, refined and sharpened and perfected by the very man who once trained to kill them. The hunter had become the teacher of his former enemies, but there was a darker thread woven into that legacy. Hans Lürse was not alone in his choice. He was a fragment of vast Operation Paperclip that carried hundreds of German scientists across the Atlantic. Engineers and pilots injected knowledge that leaped the United States years ahead, in jets and missiles and rockets, from fighter wings to the race for space itself. Their fingerprints stretched far beyond the ruins of 1945. The contrast remains eternal and troubling. To Germany, he was a deserter, pure and simple, a man who turned his back during their darkest hour. To America, he was never fully trusted either. Always a foreigner bearing suspicious gifts. Always a reminder of enemies they had bled to destroy. But to history, he was something far stranger. A bridge between two colliding worlds, between failure and triumph, between destruction and rebirth. Lürse proved that loyalty to machinery could outlive loyalty to nations, to the pursuit of flight itself. He showed that a single pilot, armed with knowledge instead of guns, could alter the destiny of air combat for generations of pilots, yet unborn. His legacy is not one of glory or shame. It is of pure consequence and change. A reminder that progress often comes from neither heroes nor villains, but from those caught in the cracks of history itself, who choose survival and truth above flags and oaths. The Bf-109 that glided across front lines in silence did not carry a man alone in its cockpit. It carried the seeds of an entirely new era. An era where jets would decide wars, where nations would rise and fall based on mastery of machines. Hans Fiffleirs vanished into history's deepest shadows, but the skies of the modern world still bear his unseen signature. In the dying winter of 1944, Hans Fiffleirs made a choice few could imagine. He surrendered not just himself to enemy hands, but the very secrets of the Luftwaffe itself, trading loyalty for survival, nationalism for knowledge. That single decision rippled far beyond his cockpit walls. It shaped how America entered the jet age. It carried forward into Korean skies, where sabers clashed with MiGs in deadly combat. It whispered into Cold War darkness, where rockets rose toward space. His story is not one of battlefield heroism and glory. It is not a tale of medals or victory parades. It is a tale woven in shadows, where survival and betrayal intertwined like lovers, where the mind of a pilot carried more weight than the wings of his machine could bear. Hans Fiffleirs stood at the crossroads of two collapsing worlds. To Germany, he was a traitor beyond redemption. To America, a stranger bearing gifts. To history, an unsolved cipher. And yet through him, the legacy of German aviation bled into American strength like transfused blood, ensuring that the skies of the 20th century were written not by chance or luck, but by cold calculation and choice. This is the haunting truth that lingers. Sometimes the greatest shifts in history are not made by armies or nations, but by a single man who refuses to die, with his uniform still buttoned. The Bf-109 that slid to rest on muddy American soil was not a wreck marking defeat. It was a door opening to tomorrow. Through it stepped the Cold War itself, the jet age in all its glory, a future forged in fire and steel. Hans Fiffleirs, unknown to monuments everywhere, absent from textbooks in schools, remains the reminder that war is decided, not only by who fights hardest, but by who dares to hand tomorrow to the enemy. And in that silence, as his fighter came to rest, he did exactly that with calculated precision. They called him the guardian of Hitler's jets, the man who breathed life into the Me-262. But one frozen morning in 1944, Hans Fiffleirs did the unthinkable without hesitation. He landed his Messerschmitt fighter, not in familiar German territory, but in the waiting arms of the enemy. Why would a Luftwaffe test pilot choose such betrayal? The man who birthed the Me-262 from blueprints, hand over his most precious secrets to America? And how did that single landing in mud change the future of air combat forever? December 1944 found Europe locked in steel coffins. Every breath from the Reich was a prayer, whispered into empty skies that no longer listened. The Luftwaffe, once a roaring storm of blitzkrieg lightning, now reduced to brittle bones of rusted steel, scattered under endless Allied bombing campaigns. The hunters of 1939 had become the hunted prey.